Since America's founding, the concept of individual rights has been woven into the national fabric. As my friend and scholar Marion Glendon has written, it has given weak members of our society, quote, an instrument to amplify their voices, and also allows us to, quote, train a spotlight on the appalling violations of human life, liberty, and dignity that occur every day in many parts of the world. Consistent with our strong rights tradition, today it is my honor as Secretary of State to announce the release of the 2019 Human Rights Report. Now, every year since 1977, the State Department has, through this report, put the world on notice that we'll expose violation of human rights wherever they occur. We have told those who disgrace the concept of human dignity they will pay a price, that their abuses will be meticulously documented and then publicized. By articulating abuses and pressuring non-compliant regimes, we can effect change. We've certainly seen that. Over the years, this report has pushed governments to change course and cease engaging in brutality and other abuses. We hope that it will continue to do so and cause oppressive regimes to honor human rights in places where those voices are often silenced and where deep yearnings for tolerance and respect have for too long gone unfulfilled. This year's report evaluates the practices of roughly 200 countries and territories. It represents a giant collaboration between hundreds of officers at U.S. missions around the world and here at the Department who are doing the Lord's work in defending the dignity of their fellow man. I'm proud of each and every one of them. I wish I could say that the record of every country evaluated this year's report is spotless or even improved, but it's simply not the case. Take Iran. Last year, the regime killed over 20 people and arrested thousands without due process just for protesting for their rights. The government banned media outlets from covering the demonstrations. This continues the pattern of cruelty that the regime has inflicted upon the Iranian people for the last 4 decades. Meanwhile, in South Sudan, military forces waged sexual violence against civilians based on their political allegiances and their ethnicity. In Nicaragua, when citizens peacefully protested Social Security benefits, they were met with sniper fire. Critics of the government have faced a policy of exile, jail, or death. Then there's China, which is in a league of its own when it comes to human rights violations. In just 2018, China intensified its campaign of detaining Muslim minority groups at record levels. Today, more than 1 million Uyghurs, ethnic Kazakhs, and other Muslims are interned in re-education camps designed to erase their religious and ethnic identities. The government also is increasing its persecution against Christians, Tibetans, and anyone who espouses different views from those or advocates those of government or advocates change in government. Even some of our friends, allies, and partners around the world have human rights violations. We document those reports with equal force. Our aim is always to identify human rights challenges and use American influence and power to move every nation towards better, more consistent human rights practices. As I suggested at the beginning, our committed defense of human rights stems from America's founding principles. It's our tradition. America is founded on those self-evident truths that each of us is endowed with the rights that cannot be forfeited. They are the ones upon which no government anywhere in the world should be allowed to tread. Our Constitution codified those rights into law, and with time they became not known as American rights, but more fundamentally across the world as human rights. Internationally, indeed, they were incorporated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 30 short articles. Scores of countries have looked to these documents for their inspiration as they drafted their own constitution and founded their own nations. Today, the State Department continues to play a leading role in championing human rights across the globe, honoring the vision of our founders, and expressing our time-honored American aspiration for all people to be free. By issuing today's report, we deploy the truth about abuses occurring around the globe as one of the most powerful weapons in America's diplomatic arsenal. Thank you, and I'll now turn it over for questions to Ambassador Kozak. Ambassador Kozak?
Morning. Thought I might say a few words about how the report is prepared, just so that we have that background, and then be happy to take questions. As the Secretary mentioned, the report has been a legislative requirement on the executive branch going back to the late 1970s. The origins of this were that Congress, in making decisions on security assistance initially, said, you know, we find ourselves giving security assistance to countries that sometimes have pretty unsavory records, and we would like to know what the factual situation is before we make those judgments. So they imposed on the executive the requirement that each year we prepare a report. Initially, it was on the situation of human rights in countries that were recipients of security assistance, but then in later years, Congress broadened that out. So we now do reports on every country that is a member state of the UN, and as the Secretary mentioned, some territories as well. For example, Hong Kong, while part of China, has a distinct system. So we do a separate report on it. The way the reports are done, there are instructions that are prepared each year during the summer and go out to our embassies abroad. What they change sometimes a bit year to year when we find that things weren't too clear in a previous year or something, and we will rectify them. But they've been pretty consistently the same over the years. And what those instructions seek to do is basically ask a series of questions. You know, were there reports of extrajudicial killings in the country of your assignment or not? Were there credible reports of torture or not? You know, if so, how much, type of thing. So we're asking exactly the same questions for every country. There's not one set of questions for the United Kingdom and a different set for North Korea or something. It's exactly the same questionnaire. What differs amongst the reports is the answers, and our people in the field strive to gather facts. One thing the Secretary has been very strong on as we went through the editing process this year is, you know, let's keep it to the facts, ma'am, and not draw conclusions, but try to always get back to what are the facts we know about this, and can we repeat those and let the facts speak for themselves. So that's the way it's done. In process terms, the report is prepared at the embassy or consulate, with a couple of exceptions where we don't have an embassy or consulate like North Korea or Iran. It gets prepared in the regional bureau here by the desk officers. But in all the rest of the cases, it's done by the human rights officer at post. It's reviewed up the chain in the embassy. The first draft gets sent into Washington. Then we have a staff of editors in DRL who go through and are comparing what we're seeing there to other reporting on the subject. We look at, you know, international human rights organizations and what they're saying. And this is often just to test our people. You can go back and say, well, you know, you said this, but we see that Amnesty International says that. What is the explanation for the discrepancy? And we try to sharpen the focus in that way. Eventually, we make edits. It goes back out to the embassy again for a second go-round of review and editing. And then they send their final version in. We do a final edit on it. And then if there are any discrepancies, we work those out with the regional assistant secretary concerned and get the final version done. So that's the process for every country in the world. Again, there's not a different process for friends and foes. It's all the same. And what we're trying to do is to just get as clear and as factual a report as we possibly can. One final comment on that is, obviously, we can't document every abuse that's occurred in a place because sometimes, unfortunately, they're so widespread that you just wouldn't have enough pages to write them. So what we try to do is have a description of the trend in that country and then give an example. So if it says there were credible reports of torture, we try to quantify that a bit. You know, was it one isolated incident or was it widespread and systematic? But then we'll give an example. But it's just that, an example. The fact that some other case isn't mentioned in the report doesn't mean it was less important. It's just that we're using one as an illustration of the behavior that unfortunately is sometimes replicated en masse. With that, I think I'll stop and go to your questions.
Any questions?
Yeah.
Yes. Harold Bloomberg. Mr. Ambassador, I'm wondering what signal you think it sends that in the preamble to the report, the Secretary just says flat out that the administration's policy is to engage with other countries regardless of their human rights record.
Yeah. And that has been the policy, and often is I mean, what we're saying there is we will engage. Sometimes we're engaging for the purpose of trying to get them to change their human rights practices. Sometimes it's because we're trying to get them to stop threatening their neighbors. But I think the reason that that's in the preface is to make it clear that our engaging with them does not mean we are approving of or accepting of their behavior. We're saying we're engaging with them despite their behavior sometimes, and trying to use our engagement to make improvements in that. So that's the sense I think that he was conveying there.
Associated Press.
Thanks. Last year in this report, there was a bit of a kerfuffle over whether or not the Palestinian territories or the West Bank would be called occupied Golan, and the Golan was in last year's report referred to as Israeli-occupied Golan Heights, but this year it says Israeli-controlled Golan Heights. Does that signal any kind of a change in the administration's position as it relates to the Golan? And then the second thing is that are governments asked to respond to what's identified in these reports? Do you accept foreign governments' comments on what this is? And I say this again in relation to Israel because it makes a point of, and it's the only that I can find one where it says we have sought input from the government of Israel on this. Are any other countries given the same opportunity?
In sequence on the descriptor of what kind of territory in Israel, as we tried to shift last year, and this, by the way, is not a human rights issue. It's a legal status issue, and so the decisions on that get made by the regional bureau, by the legal advisor's office, and we followed their lead. But I think what they were trying to signal there is what we're trying to do is report on the human rights situation in those territories, and so you're trying to find a way of describing the place that you're reporting on, and occupied territory has a legal meaning to it. I think what they tried to do was shift more to just a geographic description. So we said Israel, Golan, West Bank, Gaza, Jerusalem, and it's a complicated report because there are sometimes multiple authorities who have authority over people in particular parts of that territory. So it's a very complicated one to write. But my understanding from the policy bureaus on this is that there's no change in our outlook or our policy vis-a-vis the territories and the need for a negotiated settlement there. On the
Input.
reference to the input, that is something that and I think it's back in the annex, that we do try. We don't ask the governments to comment on a draft of the report. The report isn't shown. I mean, Congress sees it the morning of, you guys see it an hour or two later than Congress, and you have a jump on the rest of the world in that respect. But during the year, if our embassies are doing their job, they're out trying to gather data on human rights. They're taking up concerns that they see and so on. So they are getting input from the government. And in a lot of cases where you're looking at things where you want data, or there's an allegation that this was an extrajudicial killing, you go to the government concerned and say, okay, and what's your story on this? And they'll say, no, it was a shooting in self-defense by the police or something. If there's a dispute like that, then we try to report it. Now, in the case of the Israel report, I think it was felt that because of the different sources of information we get, and that sometimes each of them will accuse the other of being biased, that we just made it explicit in that report. But it's it's explicit in the reports overall, so the practice isn't any different, the form was a little bit different.
A quick clarification on this point, sir, if I may. If I may.
Let's call on folks, Said, okay? Now,
Oh,
I'm
sorry.
gonna
Can
call
I-
on folks.
Because, okay.
I'm gonna call on you, Said, please.
Sure,
Go ahead.
thank you very much.
for us.
I'm sorry for interruption, I just wanted to follow on Matt. Very quickly, so we can understand, you no longer consider the West Bank to be occupied in these reports?
No, I said that our policy on the status of the territories had not changed. That is my understanding of our current thing. We decided not to use the term in the reports
And
because
Gaza-
it's not a human rights term, and it was distracting.
And on the violence on the Gaza fence, you're citing the Israeli Defense Forces said this and so on. Did you talk to anyone in Gaza about this? Did you gather information, or do you have any mechanism to gather information on what's going on in Gaza?
We talk to non-governmental organizations. We talk to the Palestinian Authority. We don't talk to Hamas, I must say. So we don't try to reflect their point of view. We rely on media. We basically try to vacuum up. It's the same kind of job you all do as reporters. We're trying to look at all credible or potentially credible sources of information, suck them in, match them against each other, and see if there's a consistent story there, great. If there's a divergence, we try to explain the divergence. We don't try to judge that one version is accurate and the other one isn't. We're using, essentially applying the same standards to different sources of information.
Let's go to Washington Post.
In the section on Saudi Arabia, you described the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, but there is no mention in that section in the Khashoggi section on Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who many believe may have directed the killing. And so I wanted to, even though he's mentioned in passing later on in a separate section in corruption, he's not mentioned in the Khashoggi section. So I wanted to ask you why you didn't mention him, and if you think you were pulling any punches.
I think with respect to the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, the U.S. has been very clear. This was a horrendous, horrific act. That the people responsible, regardless of their level, should be held to account, should be brought to justice. As a result of diplomatic contacts, the Saudi government, I think, as reflected in the report, the king has said that that is their policy to do a proper investigation and bring to account those who are responsible for the killing. That investigation is still underway. We can all have our suspicions or our speculation as to where it may lead, but our effort has been to have where it comes out to be fact-driven rather than opinion-driven. But we also are committed to getting all the facts, and we're going to hold the government of Saudi Arabia to its promise that they will do a thorough investigation and find all the facts. I think, as the report reflects, they have begun an investigation. They've indicted some people. They have more people under suspicion and under investigation, but it's not a complete, by any means, investigation at this point. So we're sort of in the middle of that movie, and hopefully, as it plays out, we'll get a clearer set of facts as to who was and who was not responsible, and act accordingly. Where we have had strong factual information, videotapes or others, we have or statements by the governments concerned, we've already taken measures in terms of imposing visa restrictions and sanctions on some of the people that are prime suspects in the case. But that doesn't mean there are not others. It just means the investigation and the facts haven't taken us there yet.
Press trust of India.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you about what is the assessment about human rights situation in China, where hundreds and thousands of people of religious minorities have been put behind bars?
Yeah, I think, as the secretary just mentioned, they're in a league of their own. For me, you haven't seen things like this since the 1930s of rounding up. Some estimations are in the millions of people, and then putting them into camps and and torturing them, abusing them, and trying to basically erase their culture and their religion and so on from their DNA. It's just remarkably awful. We have tried to, over the year, we've been trying to push this information out, trying to gain wider international attention to the problem. I would say we've had maybe some success in that respect, in that initially the Chinese government was denying that there were any camps or that anything was going on. Now they're saying, well, they're camps, but they're some kind of labor training camps, and that it's all very voluntary and so on. Now, you know, that does not match the facts that we and others are saying, but at least I think we're starting to make them realize that there's a lot of international scrutiny on this, and none of it is good from their standpoint. It's really it's one of the most serious human rights problems in the world today.
CBS.
Thank you. You said earlier when during the editing process, the secretary said to you, you know, let's just keep this to the facts, and you talked about
Yep.
how it's written and then it goes up, and of course, like anything we do as well, it goes through an editing process. So to Carol's question, I'm curious if at any point during this process there was a version of the Saudi section that included some evaluation or mention of the culpability of the Crown Prince in
No.
the Khashoggi killing.
Well, I won't go into. I don't want to do that for every report, but we have not only in the report, but I think in any other format, tried to draw our own conclusions as to who wasn't and who wasn't responsible. There are two governments that have jurisdiction, criminal jurisdiction over the case, the Turkish government and the Saudi government, and we are pushing for a genuine, transparent, thorough, factual investigation. And you know, until we see that, trying to speculate about who might or might not have been involved is just not productive. So that's where we've been.
New York Times.
Thanks very much for doing this. One more question on the Saudis, and then one additional one. In the Saudi case, clearly the United States has gained a good deal of intelligence information that you've read about in the Times, the Post, elsewhere, that suggests what the evidentiary base is for their conclusion that with medium to high confidence that the Crown Prince was directly involved. I'm wondering if you have made sure that that information has been shared with the Saudi investigators to make it a little bit more difficult for Saudi Arabia to brush aside the complicity of the Crown Prince in this. And then I just wanted to ask you about North Korea, because in previous reports you had referred to egregious human rights violations. I missed that word here, but maybe you replaced it with something else.
On the last first, I think the format we've been using the last year or two in the summary up front is that where we try to say for each country significant human rights issues included, and then what basically we're trying to do, we have a template there. If it's torture, if it's extrajudicial killing, and some other criminal libel, some other serious things, they go in that section. There are other human rights violations that we don't put in there because every country you can come up with a ton of them. But we're trying to say, in the executive summary, let's try to hit the worst forms and see if those were present or not in the country. Where egregious has come in is that there are happily some countries where none of those things are present. So we say there were no reports of egregious human rights violations. But I don't know that we've said that we've characterized North Korea as, I mean, implicitly it is egregious because it has a litany of all the different things that they do that are fitting into that paragraph. And then you asked about
the intelligence information.
Yeah, and I just don't know what our law enforcement people have done with their counterparts in the other countries. So, you know, have to refer you
Has
to-
that data been shared with you in the preparation of this report? Did you receive the CIA assessment in either classified or
I'm not
unclassified
going to go
form
into.
that would?
I'm not going to go into intelligence.
Okay, so what we should report is the State Department is not saying
No,
whether or not it reviewed the intelligence report about that came to the conclusion that the Crown Prince.
When we do these reports, let me generalize this. When we do these reports, we seek all relevant sources of information, including U.S. intelligence information.
And you will not say whether in the
But
Saudi
I'm not
case you
going
got-
to say what that was in any particular case, because I can't
I
comment
didn't ask you what
on
it was, I was
intelligence.
asking you if you received it in the Saudi case.
I'm not going to even say with respect to particular countries, whether it's Saudi or anybody else. So I'm not giving you an answer about Saudi, I'm giving you a general answer that I'm not going to say this, but I can say that we routinely review intelligence information as part of our daily job. When we're doing the reports, we look at classified reporting, State Department reporting, we look at classified reporting from other agencies, because that's part of the panoply of information that we try to boil down and come up with a coherent report.
Al-Ghura. Shah.
If you need to rank the countries, who are the worst countries and who are the best?
That's something we don't do. I know some of our legislative frameworks require us to put people in tiers and that kind of thing. I think one of the strengths of the Human Rights Report over the year is we don't do that. So people there's no incentive to shade your reporting to try to avoid being in one tier or to be ranked in some way or another. We just try to report the facts on each country as best we can assess them, and let the reader draw the conclusion. Now, when I was just mentioning that executive summary paragraph, one of the reasons that we have tried to get it more into a template format there is so that the reader can look at that. And I think if you go through the reports, if you see a country that says there were no reports of egregious human rights violations, that's probably in the pretty good category, even though when you read the body there may be some issues, but at least they're not these really serious ones. But then if you look at another one and they've got extrajudicial killing, they've got torture, they've got rape as a weapon of war, killing journalists, closing down independent media, and bang, 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 all of those things, you'd say, well, that probably fits in the worst category or pretty close to it. But we try to make it so that the reader can draw that conclusion, but we don't draw those conclusions ourselves.
CNN.
Thank you. Going off of that, Mr. Ambassador, in the Iran section, you say that their human rights record remained extremely poor. That seems to be editorializing much more than in other instances where you just lay out the human rights violations. Why that use of kind of editorial language? And a second quick question, why not comment on reproductive rights again in this report?
Okay, on the, that actually may be a holdover from past things. We used to have remained extremely poor, and I think we've tried to get away from that. And frankly, I don't know why we missed it in that case.
So it has nothing to do with the fact that Iran seems to be the bogeyman of this
Yeah, well,
administration?
it's a true statement. I mean, it has not changed, but we try not to generally put that characterization in anymore. There was a time that we did 20 years ago, and we don't do it anymore. On reproductive rights, actually, I thought I might get asked about that, so I came this year with, let me walk through this just so that we all have the same background and terminology. Last year I had to ad-lib it and do it from memory, but I went back and got my quotes. The term reproductive rights comes from the 1994 Cairo Declaration on Population and Development that was then reaffirmed in the 1995 Beijing Declaration and Platform of Action. So that's where this term comes from. These were outcome documents of two big conferences that were consensus-driven. In other words, the outcome document needed the consensus of all the states that were present, which included the Vatican, for example. So in trying to form that consensus, the head of our delegation in Cairo was then Vice President Gore. And in a speech at the National Press Club right before the conference, he said, "The United States would never assert that a woman's right to choose an abortion should be internationally guaranteed. We believe that decisions about the extent to which abortion is acceptable should be the province of each government." And he further said that the same principles should apply to contraceptives. Nations have the right to make them legal, but the United Nations is not seeking to establish a basic right to their availability. And then at the conference himself, he said, let's take a false issue off the table. The United States does not seek to establish a new international right to abortion. We do not believe abortion should be encouraged as a method of family planning. We also believe that policymaking in this matter should be the province of each government. So that's what the U.S. position was going in. The text of the Cairo Declaration says, women who have unwanted pregnancy should have access to reliable information and compassionate counseling. Any measures or changes related to abortion within the health system can only be determined at the national or local level according to national legislative process. In circumstances where abortion is not against the law, such abortion should be safe. Now, so that's the background on where that term comes from in international practice. The term reproductive rights was first introduced into the Human Rights Report's instructions, not in the report itself, in 2009. And that instruction read, reproductive rights. This includes the basic right of couples and individuals to decide freely and responsibly the number, spacing, and timing of their children, and to have the information and means to do so free from discrimination, coercion, and violence. So that was what we were being asked to report on. There was no mention of abortion. In the 2011 report, subheadings were included in the section on women, because the section was long, so we put subheadings in, and reproductive rights was one of them, covering the information that I just mentioned. In 2016, the instructions expanded and did include a mention of abortion, but only in this context. Emergency health, we were supposed to report on emergency health care, including services for management and of complications arising from abortion, regardless of whether abortion is legally permitted. So the upshot here is the United States did not seek and did not obtain international consensus that there's a human right to abortion. When the term was used in the Human Rights Report context, it was not defined as including any right to abortion. And that was the position of the United States government under successive administrations, including the previous administration, that there was no internationally recognized right to abortion. Instead, the position has always been it's up to each sovereign state to make a policy decision on, whether to allow or prohibit abortion or have restrictions on it. And that was the, position enunciated by Vice President Gore, and it remains the position to this day. Now, the reason we stopped using the term in the reports was that some advocates had begun to claim that, notwithstanding the history I've just given you, that the term reproductive rights did include the right to abortion. And so rather than using a term that now has two completely divergent meanings to it, we decided to go back and use the U.S. statutory standard that we report on coercive population practices such as forced and coerced abortion and involuntary sterilization. So that is why we got away from using that term. It's just become a term that people are ascribing their own meanings to, and we don't like.
Is there any evaluation of access to kind of women's health practices in your evaluation?
Yeah, and on that, we did for some years carry things like maternal mortality rate, availability of contraceptive information, and so on. And at one time that probably was very useful because you couldn't access it other ways. But we figured out, what we said in the instructions was go look at these websites that there's one group that is sponsored by USAID. It's called Demographic Health. I've forgotten the name. It's DHS, but it doesn't mean Department of Homeland Security. And then there's a World Health Organization website. So rather than trying to summarize what was in those, we've just put those links to those data sets into the annex of the report so people can look it up on their own. And by the way, we've done the same thing on other sections. We used to summarize in the Human Rights Report what the contents of the International Religious Freedom Report were. We would summarize the Trafficking in Persons Report. Now, thanks to the wonders of Vice President Gore's internet, we are able to just put hyperlinks in so people can go find those things on their own. And that's
an interesting reference, because you held him up to be the standard bearer of what the U.S. position is on abortion.
all right.
Let's go red side right there.
I would like to have a review about the situation in Latin America, especially Venezuela. And also I would like to have this opportunity to talk about Venezuela. One of the biggest challenges are to get the humanitarian aid into the country. What if Nicolás Maduro approved that U.S. aid can go into the country? What would be the U.S. response about that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I think that has, and I would refer you, I think my friend, Special Representative Abrams was here yesterday commenting on all of this, but our position has been that they should let the aid into the country. What we have not been willing to do is to turn aid over to the Maduro government, because we've seen what happens with the so-called CLAP program they have that's supposed to feed people. By most estimates, 70% of the funding of that gets stolen by officials in the government. So it's not an efficient way, and it only goes to people that they favor politically.
Venezuela, human rights?
Human rights situation in Venezuela is terrible. I think it's well documented in this report, and of course it's only, this report goes through the end of last year, and it's gotten only worse since then. So, but I think I'll leave, we had a very good briefing on this yesterday, so I'll leave you to refer you back to that.
ABC?
In the report, on the section on Myanmar, it mentions the vast majority of such abuses continued with impunity. Would you agree that that could be perhaps in part because the United States still has not designated the violence against the Rohingya as a genocide, and because the sanctions against Myanmar have been limited to 2 military units and only a handful of senior officers?
Yeah. Look, the sanctions that had been on Burma previously were taken off because of the election of the Aung San Suu Kyi government and so on. So you don't want to go back and penalize the elected civilian government for the behavior of the military. So I think what we tried to do this time was to be a little more targeted in the sanctions, but it's not limited to that. You're correct. There's 5 generals that have had financial sanctions put on them. 2 divisions of the Burmese army, I think it's the 33rd and 99th, if I recall correctly, who make a specialty of the kinds of atrocities that were being committed in Rakhine State. But in addition to that, we have revoked the visas of large quantities of people. We've cut off what little bit of mill cooperation was beginning to occur. You know, this has had really serious consequences for the relationship, and we're not done yet. We're not satisfied with their response. I mean, yes, at this point, the active phase of the atrocities are at least in a lull, but there are a lot of Rohingya, 700,000 or so, who are left in Burma. So we're trying to navigate how do we get humanitarian relief to them, to the people who had to flee, and how do we persuade the government to let people come back in a voluntary way where they would be safe. Right now, you've got the same commanders in place, and I think people rightly conclude they wouldn't be safe from another assault like what they got. But, you know, we keep working the problem. I think what you've seen, too, is we had been one of the ones to put major effort into exposing the problem. We did a study that our Bureau financed that did a very good job of polling people in a scientific method in the refugee camps and figuring out just what had happened to them and what were the trends and practices there. But we've also been very supportive of the effort. For example, the UN made the independent fact-finding mission that they had there. You know, I think what we've said is our conclusions and theirs coincide very much. So this business of making a designation, it's a messaging management tool. It's not it has no legal effect. And what we were trying, I mean, the usual reason you say something like that is you're trying to call attention to it. Our feeling is we've called plenty of attention. What we're trying to do now is get people to take action and put more pressure on. We're very heartened by the fact that there's a movement stirring within Burma right now to go back in and relook at the Constitution and hopefully downgrade the political power of the military and upgrade that of the civilian elected government. Because in the end, it's going to be that's going to make a change on the ground. You've got to get where the military doesn't feel that it has complete charter to be able to rampage around and do whatever it wants, that it needs to be accountable civilian political leaders who have control over it. So that's where our policy is aiming. That's what we're trying to achieve, and, you know, we've mentioned some of the tools we're using.
Final question, right back there, please.
North Korea, is North Korea making progress as they engage in talks with the United States?
No, we haven't noticed any progress on human rights, so we keep, that's why we're calling out their practices, and we keep pushing on this. I mean, what we have done over the years is, I think, the U.S. has been in the forefront of trying to expose what North Korea is doing and bring international attention to it. Also trying to help those who are trying to get information back into North Korea so that people there start to realize what the standard in the rest of the world is and how the rest of the world views their country. But it's still one of the worst human rights situations in the world. It has not improved, and you know, that's going to be part of our effort for some time to come, I'm afraid, is how do you try to convince a regime like that to change its behavior.
Great. Ambassador Kozak, thank you very much for being with us today.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all.